Jalen Warley is not your typical Gonzaga power forward. Here's why that's great news for Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to provide news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Folks, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5. And if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. So download the FanDuel app today. Well, folks, number 10 in our player preview series. If you listened to Monday's show, the first episode after Gonzaga's game against Texas Southern, you know that we said we were still going to finish up the player preview series. We always like to get them done before the season starts, but miscalculated how many different shows we would need to do about Tyon Grant-Foster and the recruiting for Gonzaga in the month of October. So didn't quite get all of these done, but good opportunity for us today to talk about Jalen Warley, who had a tremendous performance off the bench for Gonzaga on Monday. We're going to talk about Jalen Warley's history, how he ended up here in Spokane. We're going to talk about his new role. He's playing power forward. He didn't play power forward at Florida State. We're going to talk about what that means for him through the lens of his best and worst case scenarios for this upcoming season. And then we're also going to talk about his expected role and expected production this year. I do want to mention before we get into the Jalen Warley stuff that, again, if you listened to the live show, one of the pitfalls of going live directly after games is sometimes we miss things that happen in the post-game press conference. You may have seen this, but I talked about on the show that Tyon Grant-Foster was a shocking starter for Gonzaga, and I said I did not think he was going to start and was very surprised that I was wrong about that. Well, it turns out Tyon Grant-Foster was not supposed to start. If you missed this story, Mark Few said after the game that an assistant coach submitted the lineup for Gonzaga incorrectly to the officials and that Tyon was not expected to be a starter. He didn't know until it was announced at the kennel. Just another weird saga in what has been a very bizarre start to Tyon Grant-Foster's career. He had a great game yesterday. It doesn't matter that he didn't end up starting that game or that he wasn't supposed to start that game, but certainly another strange wrinkle to what has been a unique story for him and his Gonzaga career. But we're not talking Tyon Grant-Foster today. We're talking Jalen Warley history, 6'7" wing. Again, he was a guard. He was listed as a guard coming out of high school. He was a guard at Florida State. He came from Norristown, Pennsylvania. He was a 4-star recruit in the 2021 recruiting class at 247 Sports, 34th ranked player at 247 Sports. That was 2 spots behind Efton Reed. That was 12 spots ahead of where Nolan Hickman was in that class for reference. Warley picked Florida State over Clemson, Creighton, Louisville, Marquette, and a handful of other schools. Lots of interest in the 4-star wing out of Pennsylvania. He immediately played a role for Florida State as a freshman. Worth pointing out here, we're going to look at all 3 of Warley's seasons at Florida State. In all 3 instances, he played for Coach Leonard Hamilton. Hamilton was notorious. He retired after last year. Was notorious for playing 10, 11 different guys in a lineup and not playing anybody much more than like 25 or so minutes per game. And that's kind of what we saw from Warley as a freshman. Started 5 out of 31 games, played about 19 minutes per game, averaged just 4 points, 2.5 assists, about 2 boards per game, only 34% on 2-point attempts, only 30% from 3. That was 9 of 30. But he did have some great games, including as a freshman, his first time playing Duke. I should say his first time playing at Duke, at Cameron Indoor as a pure freshman, a player who averaged 4 points per game. Warley went out and had 15 points, 7 boards, and 6 assists. Pretty clear, even at the time, he was not afraid of the moment. Came back as a sophomore, had a similar season, but boosted his numbers. 32 games, started 21 of them, played about 28 minutes per game. That was a career high for him. Averaged about 7 points, 3.5 assists, 3 rebounds, and 1.3 steals per game. Shot over 50% on 2s that year, so a huge improvement from where he was as a freshman. 32% from 3. He went from 9 of 30 as a freshman to 10 of 31 as a sophomore. So literally just made one more 3 his sophomore year. About 68% from the free throw line. Had his career high 23 points with 2 assists on 9 of 11 shooting that year in a home game against Pitt. Returned for his junior year, 33 games, 32 starts. So each year progressively got more and more involved in the starting lineup, but he only played 24 minutes per game as a junior, averaged a career high 7.5 points, 2.8 assists, 2.6 rebounds, and 1.3 steals per game. 2-point percentage dropped again. This time he was only 43% on his 2-point attempts, just 14% from three, folks, 1 of 7. So Warley went from shooting 33s as a freshman to 31 threes as a sophomore to just 7 threes as a junior. Pretty clear there was a directive from the coaching staff or a conscious decision to basically not attempt to shoot any threes from beyond the arc. Just made 1 3 as a junior, 72.5% from the free throw line, tied his career high in a game at Louisville, 23 points, 6 rebounds, and 3 assists in that one. Warley ended up transferring from Florida State after that year. He landed at Virginia. Talk about that in a second, but it's also worth noting that part of Warley's decision to leave Florida State stemmed from a lawsuit he and 5 other players filed against Coach Leonard Hamilton, asserting that they did not get paid promised NIL compensation. It was one of the first lawsuits of its kind because, again, now with the House settlement and with schools being able to directly pay players, ideally these situations won't continue to happen. But what we saw in the early part of the COVID era was teams making promises and not delivering on that financially, and the players not having much recourse because, again, there's no contracts, there's no guarantees of that nature. So Warley, again, alongside 6 other players, those 6 players total, asserted that they were each told they were going to be paid $250,000 by Leonard Hamilton and an associate of his. So $1.5 million total. It never showed up. They never got paid. Lawsuit, as far as I know, remains ongoing. But that obviously was a big part of Warley's decision to enter the transfer portal. He committed to Virginia and planned to spend his final season of college basketball playing for Tony Bennett and the Hoos. Instead, Tony Bennett, 17 days before the 24-25 season was set to begin, he opted to retire very suddenly, the same way that Bruce Pearl did this offseason. And the hope was that he would give the job to his associate head coach, Ron Sanchez, and that the roster would stay together because entering the transfer portal that late in the offseason wasn't a very tenable option for many of these players. And indeed, that became true. Only one player from Virginia entered the transfer portal, and that was, of course, Jalen Warley, who did not want to play his final season of eligibility for a new coach in a new system. Sanchez was going to kind of roll with the same system. It was a smart decision. Virginia was awful last year. They were not good, and Warley would have been buried on a very not good team in the ACC. So instead, he said, I'm transferring and I'm intending to redshirt this season because he didn't enter the portal until October 29th. So he said, I'm going to redshirt. I'm going to look for a place that will let me develop for a year and then play me as a senior in 25-26. He took a visit to Iowa State. He also took a visit to Gonzaga, ultimately, of course, ended up committing to Gonzaga and spent all of last year redshirting alongside Braden Smith, his new point guard. The two of them were on the team, working with all the players, working with the staff. I don't know at what point Jalen Warley was told or kind of found out that he was going to be playing a power forward role, but assuming that it happened at some point during last season, that further helped him get ready for what is a very different role for him this season than what he has played prior in his college basketball career. And we've already seen a lot of evidence that Warley is ready for this role. He was great at Craziness in the Kennel, 9 points, 4 of 6 shooting for him in that exhibition. And then in the actual exhibition games, he played 17 minutes against Northwest, was plus 30 in the box score in that one, had 9 points, 13 rebounds, an assist and a steal on 3 of 8 shooting. And then against Western Oregon, not quite as good in that game, or not significantly not as impactful in that game. He just had 2 points, 1 of 1 from the field. He also had 4 assists, a pair of turnovers, and a rebound in about 15 minutes of action. And then on Monday, in his first real game as a member of the Gonzaga Bulldogs, Warley had 8 points, 4 rebounds, 4 steals, 3 assists. He was 3 of 4 from the field, perfect 2 of 2 from the free throw line, had just 1 turnover in 18 minutes. He was an absolute menace in Gonzaga's half-court traps, forced a handful of steals that way. Again, led the team with 4 steals, had some assists in transition from those steals as well, looked good offensively, looked good defensively, really looked comfortable playing this power forward role for Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs. And that's what I want to talk about in the second segment. because it's a new role for Warley. And in the best case scenario, he is flawlessly adapted to this role. But there's also some scenarios where maybe we see some ebbs and flows with how he adjusts to a new role. We're going to talk about that coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, college basketball and the NBA are back, and there is no better place to get in on any of the action than at FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you missed the start of a game or if you just want to ride out the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who's going to score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team's making a late push. Gonzaga has odds for the WCC championship, their final season in the West Coast Conference, minus 180 to take home what would be Coach Few's 23rd regular season title. And right now, FanDuel is giving customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. We're still talking Jalen Warley in his first season and only season in a Gonzaga uniform. We talked about his history, how he ended up playing in Tallahassee, and then now out in Spokane via a short trip to Virginia. Now we're going to take a look at what are his best and worst case scenarios for this season. We've already seen one game in the books, so we know a little bit about what his role looks like. And so we're going to take a look at how this could potentially grow within this season. And again, for those of you who have been listening to these player preview shows, we always say best case within reason, worst case without injury. Meaning, if the player's best case scenario is that they are a Wooden Award winner and an All-American and the first pick in the NBA draft, we'll say that. But for most players, that's not realistic. So we're going to try to keep it within the realm of realisticness for each player. And then the worst case scenario for any player is that they get hurt and miss the season. Unless injuries are a part of a player's history, we're not really going to address them here in this segment. The best case scenario for Jalen Warley this year looks a lot like what we saw on Monday. 18 minutes off the bench, 8 points. That would be a career high if he averaged 8 points this year. 4 steals, those kinds of things. That's the best case scenario for Jalen Warley. Like, we saw it play out. And obviously putting up those kinds of numbers with that level of efficiency is not going to happen every single game, especially when you're playing opponents that are ranked somewhere before 300 at KenPom, which is where Texas Southern was going into that game. But a 15 to 20 minute per game role off the bench for Warley feels very doable. And in a best case scenario, it's pushing 20. It's a little bit closer to being in that 20 minute per game range. But I think the best case scenario more simply for Warley is that he is the clear-cut, unquestionable third big for Gonzaga behind Graham Ike and Braden Huff. And that's what we saw on Monday. Ismaila Diani did not enter the game until the final 10 minutes when Gonzaga was up by 40 points. That is when he entered the game for the first time. It is very clear that Jalen Warley is ahead of Diani right now in the front court rotation. And understandably, because I think what Warley adds to this team, what's so valuable, is that he can play alongside any of those 3 bigs. All of Graham Ike, all of Braden Huff, all of Ismaila Diani, all 3 of those guys are 5s. And obviously, Huff or Ike is kind of playing the 4, depending on matchups when they're on the floor at the same time. But all 3 of them are 5s. And so Warley being able to play the 4 means that he can play alongside any of them. He can play with any of those 3 players comfortably and seamlessly. And in the best case scenario, that plays out. Some of that depends on how those guys do, but ultimately his ability to play with any other player in this front court means he's going to carve out a significant role. The best case scenario for Jalen Warley is that his size, his physicality, and his active hands leads to tons of takeaways and transition opportunities. Again, not going to average 4 steals per game. That would be otherworldly. But he's going to have plenty of games where he gets 4 steals or 3 steals. I think he's going to lead Gonzaga in steals and steals per game, and he's going to do that as a bench player. In a best case scenario, that's incredible. 2.5 steals per game in 20 minutes off the bench would be outstanding. Like some of the best numbers in college basketball, if he is able to do that. The best case scenario for Jalen Warley is that he is deployed in lineups where Gonzaga is running those half-court traps or 3/4 court press. We saw that on Monday. We're going to see that more this year. Gonzaga did this with Michael Ajayi last year. There's no reason they wouldn't do that with Jalen Warley and likely Emmanuel Nicente. They have the incredible ability, Gonzaga does, that they could run lineups with Warley at the 4, Tyon Grant Foster at the 3, and Nicente at the 2. You're going to be lacking some floor spacing offensively, but it might not matter if the other team can't get the ball across half court, which might be a reality if you have those guys all on the floor at the same time. The best case scenario for Jalen Warley and for Gonzaga is that his defensive versatility means that Gonzaga can switch on screens. The broadcast brought this up on Monday night, and I thought it was an excellent point because Gonzaga so often has hedged on those screens and tried to stay with their same guys. And it's worked for the most part. I mean, it's been Gonzaga's defensive strategy for a while, and there's some good and some bad with it. But with Jalen Warley, he's a power forward who can guard any guard. And is probably one of the better, not probably, he is one of the better perimeter defenders on this team. So opposing teams who are using one of their bigs to set a screen to try to get a mismatch are instead going to force a switch that puts Gonzaga's second best perimeter defender right on their guard. That's not what other teams want. That means they either have to abandon their pick and roll actions or try to force the pick and roll to happen with their other big, in which case Gonzaga can easily counter that as well. This is a huge advantage that Gonzaga has. Warley's ability to switch and defend guards is something that Gonzaga has really lacked in the front court. Anton Watson could do it, and that he's kind of one of the only ones that they've had like Chet could, but they didn't want Chet to do that because they wanted him down low around the rim. Warley is so valuable because he is a guard who is masquerading as a power forward and has the ability to defend 1 through 4 capably. And we talk about that a lot, and we talk about players who are switchable, who can do that. It's really rare to have that in practice. And I really sincerely hope that Mark Few and Gonzaga, which it seems like they do, are recognizing how valuable this is and are utilizing it to their advantage, because Gonzaga's other bigs are not great defenders. And if Warley can be the enforcing defensive player on the perimeter, if he can force teams into not switching or not using their pick and roll actions, if he can keep players in front of him, that takes a lot of pressure off of EK, a lot of pressure off of Huff, and potentially prevents them from getting in foul trouble, which is one of the biggest concerning things that will happen to Gonzaga this year, is how much their offense stalls out if one or both of those players are in foul trouble. Warley absorbs a lot of that pressure and is able, and in a best case scenario, is able to do so seamlessly while still contributing to this team offensively. What that looks like for Jalen Warley is his playmaking skills make him one of Gonzaga's best passing big men ever. They have not had a player who is playing the power forward position who is as good of a facilitator and passer as Jalen Warley, because he is a guard, because he was a top 20 player in assists in the ACC as a sophomore. He averaged over 3 assists per game playing in a slow-paced offensive team as a guard. And now he's playing power forward. It took guys like Anton Watson and Ben Gregg and Elias Harris and insert your favorite Gonzaga power forward of the past. It took them a while to learn how to play that role, to play away from the rim, to set those side to screen ball screen actions, to turn and face, to make an entry pass, all the different things that power forwards are asked to do. It's part of the reason Michael Ajayi struggled for his entire season in Spokane, was that is not something he'd been asked to do. Warley already has those skills. And in a best case scenario, it shows up seamlessly. We see him being able to distribute the basketball, facilitate from the top of the key, play the power forward position for Gonzaga like a guard, because he is a guard. The best case scenario for Jalen Warley is that, he's not going to be a big-time scorer. He's not expected to be a big-time scorer. He didn't come here to be a big-time scorer. But he's a much more efficient scorer than he's ever been in his career. His career high 2-point percentage is 53%. In a best-case scenario, he is way ahead of that. Best case scenario for him is 15 percentage points higher. He shoots 68 to 70% on 2-pointers because the 2-point shots that Jalen Warley is taking in a Gonzaga uniform are mostly coming in transition. Our dunks, our easy lay-ins around the rim, our breakdowns where he's just wide open at the cup. He is not forcing tough shots. He's not trying to break down a defense off the dribble and forcing up a contested floater in the lane. He's not being asked to do that, so that shot diet is different and his efficiency rockets up. The best case scenario for Jalen Warley is probably that he's not much of a 3-point shooter. Again, 1 of 7 his junior year. I would be fine with that again this year. We don't need him to do that. You would like it. part of Gonzaga's struggles last year did come down to the fact that Michael Ajayi and Ben Gregg eventually, it was kind of determined were just not threats from the outside, and defenses adjusted to that. But for Warley, he may not be a three-point shooter, but if you sag off of him, he can still create. He can still make things happen in ways that Ben and Michael struggled to do. So I don't think I don't think you need Warley's best case scenario to be him suddenly finding a three-point shot. It's more that that's just not a part of his game, and that's okay. That it's not something that you're forcing or trying to make happen when it's not realistically going to be there. The best case scenario for Jalen Warley is that he's in the conversation for WCC Sixth Man of the Year, and that he's in the conversation for WCC Defensive Player of the Year, even coming off the bench, and that he's a great one-year Zag that we remember fondly in that era of great one-year Zags that we're currently in right now. The worst case scenario for Jalen Warley is really inconsistency. It's that he's adjusting to a new role, and that while he's looked good so far, tougher competition exposes some of the challenges of being a player who's been a guard for most of his career, who's now playing a different role in a different system. The biggest worst case scenario for Jalen Warley is that he struggles against bigger teams. Gonzaga's going to play teams where a 6'7" former guard is probably not the best defensive option against their front court. Not many teams, by the way, but some. St. Mary's is a good example. They're going to start either Harry Wessels or Andrew McKeever, both 7-footers at center, and they're going to start Paulus Morauskas at the 4. Braden Huff abused Paulus Morauskas last year offensively, but Morauskas is a big, strong, back-to-the-basket 4, and if Jalen Warley is guarding him, he is going to make life hard for him. The worst-case scenario for Warley is that he struggles so much defensively against bigger, more physical 4s that he's not playable in those games, or not playable at the amount that Gonzaga would like to play him. He's really maybe only in for situations where they're running that half-court trap, and he's not in the game in a longer-term role. This will also be an issue against teams like Creighton and Kentucky and Oregon and many others who have more size in their front court. The worst-case scenario for Jalen Warley is that foul issues keep him on the bench too often. He's adjusting to a new role. He's defending guys around the cup. That's not something he's used to doing. And he too often picks up 2 quick fouls and has to sit for the rest of the half. And it puts more pressure on EK, and it puts more pressure on Huff, and it puts more pressure on Ismaila Diani because they don't have their best defensive front court player for large swaths of the game. The worst case scenario for Jalen Warley is that his lack of offense doesn't make up for his great play on defense. Again, the Zags struggled last year in part because their power forwards couldn't space the floor. Gonzaga won't have that all the time because Graham Ike and Braden Huff are going to be capable floor spacers when they are playing together, but Warley does not present that same threat. And while there are other things he can do offensively, the worst case scenario is that teams are able to really, really pack in the paint when he is in the game and make life more difficult for Ike or Huff to score around the rim. And then, of course, the worst case scenario is just that the year goes a little similar to what we saw from Ajayi last year. He struggles to adjust to the role. And we see some inconsistencies where sometimes he has great games and sometimes he's making stupid turnovers or getting in foul trouble or just not acclimating to the system as well as we thought that he would. The worst case scenario is that he has a fine year, but he's kind of unmemorable. That it sort of goes like Ajayi again, where it's like, we'll move on. We'll look for the next guy. And in a few years, he kind of will just be a bit of a forgotten part of Gonzaga's history. Well, folks, Jalen Warley's role seems pretty well defined at this point. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about his expected production and his future. What does it look like beyond this year in Spokane, out of Spokane, professionally? We're going to get to all of that to close out the show coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, I have always, my whole entire life, had issues finding jeans that are actually comfortable enough for me to wear. And that's why I'm so excited to get my new pair from Doer. This local company has the most comfortable jeans, no matter what style you like, and they're available for any occasion, whether it's a quick trip to the grocery store, a night out with friends, a trip to the kennel for a game, anything like that. Doer jeans have 5 times the stretch of traditional denim, and they're antibacterial, meaning your jeans stay fresh longer so you can wear more and wash less. Doer is also made with Cool Max that regulates your body temperature and wicks moisture to keep you cool and comfortable as the temperatures change. Doer are pioneers of blending technical innovation with everyday clothing. In fact, they actually invented the original performance denim. Simply put, Dewar makes the world's most comfortable pants without having to sacrifice style. So get a pair for yourself or as an amazing holiday gift. Go now to shopdewar.com/lockedonseattle and you'll get 15% off your first order. That's shopdewar, DUER.com/lockedonseattle for 15% off. Once again, dewar.com/lockedonseattle. All right, folks, segment 3, closing out the show, continuing our Jalen Warley season preview episode. We talked about Warley's history, how he went from Tallahassee to Virginia to Gonzaga, his performance in the first game of the season on Monday night, and we talked about his best and worst case scenarios for this season. Now we're going to take a look at his more realistic role, expected production, and his future. Well, the role is obvious. Jalen Warley is Gonzaga's backup power forward. He played 18 minutes on Monday, and by my count, unless I missed something, every minute that he was on the floor, he was playing the power forward role. He did not play with both Graham Ike and Braden Huff on the floor. He did not play with Ismaila Diani and one of the other bigs on the floor. When he was on the floor, there was one other big, and then there were wings and guards. This is his role. Parker Jefferson is redshirting, and part of the reason that Parker Jefferson is able to redshirt is because Gonzaga feels confident that Warley can be their third string big and that Diani can be their fourth string big. We saw that play out on Monday. A lot of what his role is going to look like this year is pretty similar to that. I think what we saw on Monday from a performance perspective is certainly skewing towards the best case scenario. Again, he's not going to average 4 steals per game. That would be otherworldly. He's probably not going to average 8 points per game. He might. I don't think that's crazy, but he's never done it before. And while Gonzaga plays at a faster pace, he's not on the floor primarily to score. So I think something in the ballpark of what we saw from him in that game. I think a realistic expectation for Jalen Warley is that he has plenty of games like what we saw on Monday, but that those are not his averages. And he has plenty of games where maybe he doesn't play all that much, or maybe he just doesn't make a super big impact in the game, but that he's consistently part of Gonzaga's lineup and rotation. I think 15 to 20 minutes. And again, it's easy to project that when he played 18 in the first game and he played 17 in the exhibition game. I mean, we know right around the realm of kind of minutes that are being distributed to him so far this season. I don't expect that to change. Gonzaga will tighten their rotation as the season goes on. They always do. But it looks pretty clear to me that the big who's going to get squeezed out of Gonzaga's rotation, if that happens, is likely going to be Diani and not Warley. I think it'll be matchup dependent in some cases, but I think Warley's pretty clearly going to play, and he's going to play a consistent everyday role for this team. From a statistical perspective, give me like 5.5 points per game. Give me like 2-ish steals, which again, 2 steals in an 18-minute per game roll off the bench would be outstanding. That would be like some of the most efficient steal numbers in the country on a rate basis. And I think it's very possible for him with how active he is defensively and how Gonzaga is going to deploy him, where a majority of the time that he's playing, maybe not a majority, but a huge chunk of the time he's on the floor, Gonzaga is going to be running those half court and 3/4 court traps, which is a perfect opportunity for him to get tons of takeaways and steals and transition opportunities. I expect that Warley will have the most efficient scoring season of his career and that it might not even be close. Again, the highest percentage he's ever shot on 2-pointers is 53%. I think that it is realistic and reasonable to project that he is 10 percentage points higher than that. I think 63 to 65%. Not only do I think it's realistic, I think that should be the goal. I think that is very attainable because I think most of the time he's going to be, again, like I said, in the best case scenario situation, he's not going to be asked to, get the ball with 5 seconds left in the shot clock, drive and throw up a floater in the lane against ACC bigs. That's what he had to do at Florida State. He's not going to be doing that here. When he is taking shots, it's going to be because he's wide open at the rim. Or, occasionally he has some like last second shot he needs to take, but there's no real reason that he doesn't shoot 65, close to 70% on 2-pointers, which, by the way, most of Gonzaga's power forwards end up in that range. Ben Gregg was like 73%. Chet Holmgren was like 80%, but he's an absolute freak. But even Anton Watson was like over 65%. It's pretty common for Gonzaga's bigs, specifically the power forwards, to be very, very efficient because a lot of the looks that they get are very, very good looks. That is why Mark Few is one of the smartest coaches in college basketball, particularly on the offensive end of the floor. So that's more or less what I expect from Warley. 5 to 6 points, 2-ish assists, 2-ish steals, 65% from the field. Hopefully he can get 75%-ish from the free throw line. That would be a nice benefit because I think he's going to get fouled more often than usual, more often than he's used to, again, because he's playing down around the rim. And then for the future for Warley, this is it. This is his final year. Again, that's a big part of the reason that he chose to transfer from Virginia was he did not want to spend his final season of college basketball playing for an interim coach in a system that he didn't sign up for. So that's why he transferred. That's why he sat out last year, was so he could be in a system that he was comfortable with. And he chose to be in a system where he's playing a new role for his final season. I think that's incredibly cool. I think that shows the character that Jalen Warley has, that he is willing to set aside any ego of like, hey, I want to have the ball in my hands. Like, no, I'm fine with a role where I'm playing a different position, where I'm more deferential to the, most of the time Warley's on the floor, he is at best the fourth option offensively, like at best. And so being willing to be that and just be an absolute dog defensively, I think says a lot about who he is as a person and why Gonzaga was invested in bringing him in for his final season. I think he's going to go down as a very quality mercenary transfer portal addition for Gonzaga. Again, Gonzaga's the 1-year transfers that they've brought in are not typically bigs. And Warley didn't come to campus expecting to be a big, or at least we didn't expect that he was going to be a big. Michael Ajayi is obviously a recent example of a 1-year big, and they've had others. Brandon Clark is probably the most notable example in that space, but this is fairly unusual. But I think for Warley, because he had that year of development, we're going to see a very successful player and a very fun player to watch in his lone season in Spokane. We always end these shows talking about NBA future. Jalen Warley is every single part of a prototypical NBA 3-and-D wing with one incredibly glaring problem. He's not a three-point shooter. And until he becomes a three-point shooter, if he ever does, his NBA future just isn't there. It's unfortunate, but it is the reality. I think he has the NBA requisite size, physicality, and defensive talent. I think he could be an above-average defender in the NBA. But if he cannot score, if he cannot space the floor, he will not find a spot in the league. That's just how it is these days. So unless that changes, and I don't think it will at Gonzaga, I think that limits him significantly, but he could be a guy who gets G League run if he wanted. He could be a guy to make a whole heck of a lot of money playing overseas if that's the direction he wants to go as well. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We got one more of these coming your way on Thursday. And then, of course, Friday, we're getting you ready for that big game Saturday night at the Spokane Arena against the first of 3 SEC teams Gonzaga's playing this year, the Oklahoma Sooners. Big old preview of that coming your way on Friday. Thanks again, folks. Have a fantastic rest of your day. And, of course, as always, go Zags.